Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, wherever it is you're joining us around the world. We are very grateful that you are here for this session on addressing foreign influence in policy and in politics. My name is Ryan Heath. I'm the host of Politico's Global Translations newsletter and podcast. And that's where we attempt to join the dots and show you the big picture about how power operates around the world. And in this session, I think one of the reasons I'm your moderator is that before I was a journalist, I was also a civil servant and then a lobbyist. So I can bring views from all sides of the influence equation to this discussion. Now, our starting point today is that the lobbying environment is better resourced and more complex than ever before. And we see every day how lobbyists can both illuminate and obscure key facts, data, and interests around the given issue that is being discussed. And the question becomes especially sensitive when it involves foreign actors. Where does diplomacy end and improper foreign influence start, for example? Where is the balance between not being naive about foreign influence and avoiding crackdowns on legitimate commercial or academic activities? All of those questions make the OECD's latest flagship report a very welcome contribution to the open debate on this topic. And it's for those reasons that we're very happy to have the panelists that I'm now about to introduce to you joining us for this session. So first up, we have John C. Demers, who's the Assistant Attorney General in the National Security Division at the US Justice Department. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Now, before John's time as a public servant, he held senior roles at organizations such as Boeing. Next up, we have Sarah Chidgey, who's a Deputy Secretary on Integrity and International Issues at the Attorney General's Department in Australia. And Sarah's held a range of senior roles in areas of interest to national security and other sensitive areas. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, thanks.
And then last but not least, we have Professor Philip Howard, who is a Professor of Internet Studies with the Oxford Internet Institute. And you won't be surprised to learn that he is a specialist in how new technologies influence our politics and policymaking. Welcome, Professor Howard.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
So the way we'll structure this discussion is try and split it into three themes, but I'll also go with the flow. I'm not going to be super rigid about it. We'll look first at the practical realities of foreign influence, then what governments are doing to address those new trends in influence, and then we'll finish on a discussion around the OECD principles and where they might need to head so that they can have a more useful contribution to the debate as we move forward. We don't have a lot of time, and I know everyone's been listening for a long time now, so let's just dive into these practical matters. If I could start with you, Mr. Demers. Foreign influence in the US, we've all been hearing a lot about it. It's been in the spotlight in terms of Russia in electoral processes, China in economic terms. Can you introduce us to the American system for managing influence and what the risks are that you're trying to manage in terms of national security?
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Ryan. Thanks to my fellow panelists and to everyone who's on here today for listening and thinking hard about this very important topic. So this is a problem that obviously rose to life very visibly in 2016, but we should start and acknowledge that foreign influence is nothing new in politics. It's nothing new in American politics. And if you go all the way back to the founding of the American Republic, you will see George Washington, our first president, warning about foreign influence in American politics. And I think he was particularly concerned about foreign influence from non-democratic states that were trying to undermine democracy. Well, at that time, they were mainly monarchies, of course. So it's not a new problem, but let's define it first. I think it's important to remember that what we're talking about when we talk about the problem of foreign influence is not diplomacy, right? So diplomacy, I would define as speech that the speaker identifies with the country, right? So an ambassador to a country giving her views on a particular foreign policy issue or even domestic issue is not something that we worry about from a criminal perspective. I think it's good to hear their views, and the American people can assess whatever it is that the person is saying because they know the identity of the speaker. So what we're talking about, the problem of foreign influence, is influence that's covert, or corrupt or criminal. So in our system, so covert, and this I think gets us to a theme that I was listening to the prior panel, but we'll be talking about certainly in this one, which is the importance of transparency. So do the American people, do the French people, the British people know the identity of the speaker? Because very often what we've seen is an individual who is not by any apparent means a non-US person, speaking though on behalf of a foreign country. And that's really our concern from a criminal perspective, but even from an integrity of the democratic system perspective, because at the end of the day, that is somebody presenting themselves as a neutral expert and not acknowledging that they're getting paid by a foreign government to say what they're saying, whether it's in writing or whether it's on the internet or whether it's in printed form. That is corrupting to the democratic system, because the people can't assess the strength of that argument if they don't know the identity, the actual identity of the speaker, which is not that person. It's going to be the foreign government. So what's new, I think, in this space? In 2016, what was highlighted as new is, of course, the internet is new since obviously George Washington's time. And that allows a foreign speaker to reach a very large audience and also to disguise their identity. There is a certain level of anonymity on the internet, and you can pretend to be somebody else very easily. So what we saw in 2016 was clearly people who were posing, Russian actors who were posing as Americans who supported one view or another on an issue, and they were trying to influence the American conversation on that issue. We also saw another kind of foreign influence activity, and that is the hacking into and then the dumping on the internet of documents related to from the Clinton campaign and the Democratic Campaign Committee. So that's a type of foreign influence too. It's obviously criminal. They're hacking into somebody's email, but off it goes, and now it's on the internet and everybody's reading it, and someone has to respond to it. So we see the means of foreign influence have changed over time, for sure. But the basic problem there, obviously, it's criminality, but the basic problem of a lot of what we see on social media is a failure to identify the speaker, and in fact, an active desire to pretend that you are somebody else. So the end result of all of this, I think, is what we're focused on, is having people declare who they're speaking on behalf of, having them register in a way that's publicly available. And that, I think we'll get to sort of our main foreign influence statute, which is the Foreign Agents Registration Act in the next round. But that is the focus of the statute, transparency. And with transparency will come integrity. Now, of course, we also have lobbying laws that require, and election contribution laws. Obviously, money is a big player in American politics in a way it doesn't play in a lot of European politics. So it's very important in our system, for sure, to have a system that requires everybody to declare their donations, and when it comes to foreign individuals and foreign actors, actually to ban contributions in political campaigns. Ryan, I think.
Sorry, I'm muted. I apologize. You'd think I would have learned after a year of doing this. But no. Sarah, if I could turn to you now. I'm Australian, so I've got some familiarity with the Australian context. And I know the Australian government has taken new steps in recent years to address foreign influence. And I think you make a distinction between foreign influence and foreign interference. And I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about that. What are some of the behaviors that fall into each category, and what are some of the experiences of Australia? How has Australia been affected by attempts to influence it?
Thanks very much. And I think it's great that you mentioned that distinction that we make, because that's where I thought was useful for me to start on that issue, that we very much make a distinction in both our legislative regimes and more broadly between foreign influence and foreign interference. Yeah, so from our perspective, I think we treat foreign influence as generally a legitimate part of international relations, and acknowledge that point that all governments, including the Australian government, of course, make efforts to influence important issues and policies around the world. And would say that when they're done in that open, lawful and transparent way, they're welcome and can contribute to healthy democracy and robust public debate. I think, yeah, we very much distinguish that from foreign interference, which we have made some recently. At the same time, we introduced our foreign influence transparency scheme and register. Also enacted some very serious criminal offences for foreign interference, and that is very much focused on influence that is coercive, clandestine, deceptive, or corrupting, and that's contrary to Australian sovereignty, values, or national interests. So we've sort of got those distinctions. Obviously a relationship between the two, and very much the case that the scheme that we introduced with a public register for foreign influence activities is designed to address that foreign influence end, and very much about that aim for transparency of the source of influences on particularly political and government decision making. And we had been at pains, sometimes less successfully than we'd hoped, I think, to make it clear that registration under that scheme doesn't imply any wrongdoing or malign influence, of course, and in order to try and, I think, get maximum compliance and encourage people to register, we've taken very much that communication approach about foreign influence. I think what we've seen in Australia is very much the case that foreign actors, and certainly I think it is that influence, particularly from non-democratic or less transparent regimes, that can have serious implications if not disclosed and transparent, and very much that it's both the Australian public, but political and government decision makers not being able to make fully informed decisions and not having access to full information about the nature of the lobbying and the facts that they might be being presented and by whom. So that can erode, I think, public confidence in decision-making processes over time. We've particularly concentrated on those issues of parliamentary and general political lobbying as a focus for where we've regulated, as well as communication activities that have that potential to influence the public, and very much about looking for influence that is more directly connected to foreign states, foreign governments and political organisations. And I think the register has some of its limitations, I'd say, which we can sort of talk more about, I'm sure, as we get into this session, but broadly, it does let us see across the federal political landscape which countries are sort of more dominant in influence activities, and the nature of those activities to at least some degree. I think in terms of some of the influence activities we have seen, that we were looking to address some of those influences that might appear to be a local community group, but are in fact backed by foreign state actors, which wasn't necessarily visible. Media organisations, which hasn't been clear that they're funded or driven from foreign governments or foreign political organisations operating in the Australian sphere, and very much communicating on issues of political topics, potentially influencing, I guess, views in elections, and seeing some of that influence too in the research sector and think tanks through those avenues, as well as complex relationships with chains of companies that you might be able to trace back through to state-owned enterprises that are lobbying for their interests as well. quite varied, but I think we were seeing at different levels of government quite a lot of influence activities where it wasn't evident that the ultimate player was a foreign state.
Absolutely. And I can speak to that media point, not just whole media organizations, but a kind of rise of phantom or ghost journalists who appear to sort of present articles or sort of drive debate on a given topic, and no one's ever heard of them before. And sometimes it takes a while to catch on to that, but I think we are also catching on to that a little bit in the media sphere. Now, Professor Howard, if I can turn to you, I had a question about transnational influence and lobbying. Obviously, the internet has dramatically lowered the cost of doing a global communication campaign of any nature. And as we have a more globalized economy and political debate, and you have global organizations like OECD or regional organizations like the EU, you can't have those organizations existing without sort of lots of transnational debate and discussion. Wanted to get your sense of whether there have been any particular trends in recent years and the ways in which technology is either accelerating or shifting that trend in a particular direction.
Well, unfortunately, the trend line is up, right? And that's one of the reasons this kind of conversation and these kinds of policy initiatives are so important. We here at the Oxford team, we do an annual audit of global expenditures on misinformation. And at this point, we've found active misinformation operations in 82 countries. Over time, more and more of those campaigns are organized by regular PR firms based in Toronto and Sydney and New York and London. It used to be military units retasked to doing social media manipulation. That's no longer the case. And so it's becoming more prevalent as a comms and lobbying tool. It's much more professionalized than it used to be. And it's part of a strategic communications package, right? That you can now, now many different kinds of firms and governments can afford. I'd say one of the other things that's changed, especially in the last 12 months, is that China has really arrived as a misinformation superpower. We spent most of the first years of our project studying the Russian government and Russian initiatives. But since COVID and the democracy protests in Hong Kong, China has clearly developed its capacity and interest in moving public opinion in English and on social media platforms that you can't actually use in China. So these are information operations clearly directed at moving public opinion in the West. We just actually did an audit of PRC diplomats stationed in Oz, Canada, around the world, the European Union, to look at the degree of automation they employ to amplify their own reach. And so it's almost a normalization. Most diplomats would not purposefully use automation to amplify their strategic communications, but the PRC diplomats do in a pretty extensive and global way, global reach. On a good day, the major media accounts from state-backed news agencies, Russia Today, CGTN, can reach upwards of 1 billion social media user accounts. Now that figure is fairly straightforward. We know there's lots of duplicate accounts. We know lots of them are fake, and it's a sum of YouTube and Reddit and Facebook and Twitter, but it's quite a significant reach. And on a day that a Hollywood star or prominent political personality also adds their voice to misinformation, that'll really give a bump to the reach that some of these messages can get. The latest thing we're working on now is COVID-related misinformation, and there's 3 themes that I think are important to talk about in the COVID misinformation that originates from China and Russia. The first theme overall is that democracies are too weak. They won't be able to protect us in this health crisis. Elected leaders can't make decisions and stick by things. Democratic institutions can't serve us, right? This is about undermining our confidence in democratic institutions. The second message is that Russia and China are leading in the science, right? They're going to find the best of the vaccines, and their vaccine works the best. The third is that Russia and China are leading in the humanitarian assistance. providing ventilators to the White House and sending masks to the Philippines, a variety of things that are ostensibly stunts, right, publicity stunts, but the messaging is that these countries are leading on humanitarian assistance. So it's, yeah, the trend line is up. There's more and more of it, and anything that is a politically sensitive issue comes these days with some kind of automated push for or against, or blaming political Islam or blaming some other group. And I think one of the most difficult things for us to hear is that many of the tricks that used to be applied by authoritarian leaders are now often applied by our own politicians, our own lobbyists, white supremacists in our own countries. And figuring out how to handle the domestic rise of misinformation is going to be one of our big policy challenges.
Well, that's the perfect segue into what our legislative and other implements are at the government level. Might turn back to you, John. Obviously, you have the Foreign Agents Registration Act in the US, and in my experience, it's quite granular. It provides useful details in a timely manner. But I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more how it works at your end behind the scenes and how it's enforced, and what maybe needs to happen with it to keep up with the times that Professor Howard has just described. And can that even happen in a time when America faces a lot of partisan division? Is it safe that we just don't touch FARA at all, or do we need to start thinking about updating it for the digital world?
Great, well, thanks. So just a few background words then on FARA. So FARA, starting with history again, actually dates back to the 1920s and was passed as because of concerns in the US Congress about Nazi German influence activity in the US, which at that time, of course, no internet. So it's mainly newspaper articles, newspaper letters to the editor, opinion pieces, all by Americans who were not disclosing that they were actually speaking on behalf of the German government. So again, there, I think what we see is an authoritarian country trying to influence the politics of a democracy. And I have to say, if you look at our FARA cases, you will not find cases that emanate from democratic republics. You will see them consistently from authoritarian countries, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, but then around the world, the Middle East, Sri Lanka. I mean, it's just, it can get very broad. But so the way it works, and it has been updated a bit over time, and we are taking a look at whether we should further update it now to make it fit better with the rise in particular of social media. But the way it works basically is that you have to register with the Justice Department, and you have to disclose the nature of the work that you're doing and any compensation that you're receiving if you represent a foreign principal. So that includes both foreign governments and non-government actors, although there are exemptions under that piece of it too for a lot of businesses, let's say. But so you come in and you register. That is a public registry, so anybody can search that registry. We have, over the last few years, we've digitized all the records. We've made it more accessible, because one thing we do is sort of analysis on the data, which is helpful if it's digitized, but also we make it public, and so that civic society can analyze that data as well, and bring to our attention issues that they see, or raise them themselves sort of in the public sphere. So we've been moving to be much more, to make that a lot easier. Now, if somebody doesn't register, then basically there are a number of ways that we can proceed. The first, and this is something we're looking at, is basically we send them a letter of inquiry. So if we learn that they have not registered, but in fact we believe, at least there's some evidence to believe, that they're acting on behalf of a foreign power, we'll send out a letter and we'll ask for a lot of information. That works sometimes, but it is a voluntary letter. And so one thing we're looking at is, do we need civil authority to compel a response to that kind of inquiry? Now, if we have enough to open a criminal case, that is, we believe the violation of FARA was willful, so the person knew of the legal obligation and they purposefully avoided registering, then we can open up a criminal investigation and we can send out criminal orders to get that kind of information. So we've done that in a number of areas as well. But
and can you give a rough sense of how many cases you might successfully prosecute in a given year?
So prosecute on the criminal side, not too many. And that's been, maybe from 2017 to today, we've prosecuted, 10 cases. Now, but that said, what we've seen as we sort of refocused on this area after 2016 at the department. And what we saw was that the voluntary registrations, as we started refocusing, doubled from 2017 to 2021. And I don't believe that that was because there was increased foreign lobbying happen in those years. I think it was because there were a lot of foreign lobbyists who were not registering. So it didn't take a lot of cases to increase compliance with the act. And ultimately that is our stated goal, which is to get individuals to comply with the act. On the media side that we've been talking about, we've also looked at media entities and required a number of them to register Russian media entities, Russia Today, Chinese media entities. But what we're looking at there, just to be clear, is foreign funding is usually not enough. Sort of foreign government's funding is not what we're worried about there. So the BBC is not, maybe the UK government wishes sometimes it had editorial control over the BBC, but they don't. And of course, that's the way they want it in the long run. But what we look at is that question of editorial control. So is the government, and this often happens in authoritarian countries, is the government beyond the funding piece controlling what the stories are in that media? And so that at that point it becomes propaganda. And that really harkens back to where FARA started, which in fact it used to use the word propaganda. It's been sort of updated since then to be clear that we were covering a larger realm of activities. But where media becomes propaganda is what we're concerned about. And then, other than registering, what you have to do if you're the lobbyist is label all of your anything you create and disseminate with a statement that you're doing this on behalf of this foreign government, right? So that the reader, from anything from a pamphlet to something on the internet, will recognize that. And again, they can take that into account when they're assessing the credibility of those statements. So the focus, I think, over the last few years has been very successful in increasing registrations under the Act. We have also worked with our friends in Australia as they were thinking through their Act. We're working now with the UK that I know is thinking about a similar registry and sharing, I think, what works and what doesn't work as well in the US system and constantly reassessing it for us. The last point is FARA is politically neutral, right? So your question about partisanship, we do not, all we're saying is tell us who's speaking. We don't try to regulate the content of any of these communications. You could say whatever you want. You honestly could even put out disinformation if you labeled it correctly. That's a different problem. We might have to deal with it a different way. But that's not what FARA is about. FARA is tell me who's speaking and then being politically neutral about the content of that speech.
Fantastic. Well, Sarah, if I can bring you in now, you now have in Australia the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme, or FITS. And I wanted to hear a bit more about how that works and maybe compare and contrast a little with FARA. And the reason I say that is one criticism I read of the Australian system was that it's not requiring enough granular details, but then perhaps that's the point of new legislation. It's a starting point, not an end point, and you're testing things out and maybe there's change in the works. Over to you.
Thanks very much. And I should start by just noting our appreciation to colleagues in the US and Department of Justice who did provide a lot of advice and information on their scheme, and we've certainly borrowed elements of that, but ours has some differences, some of which I think probably make for some more challenges in enforcing, and just the scope of our scheme has more limitations in some ways. I should say that the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme legislation was enacted in 2018, and the Public Register and scheme came into effect in December 2018, and due to be reviewed by one of our parliamentary committees at the end of this year, so they'll sort of have a look at it after 3 years of operation. It has quite a lot of similarities with FARA, so country neutral and politically agnostic. Yes, in short, it requires individuals and organisations who undertake activities on behalf of a foreign principal to register that on our public register, the kind of activities that we cover are parliamentary lobbying, general political lobbying, communication activities, and disbursement, i.e. sort of dealing with funds. I think the significant difference that we have found, particularly in operating the scheme in practice to FARA, is that we've defined foreign principals to be foreign governments and foreign political organisations, but then rather than capturing just the sort of broad range of other foreign entities, to be a foreign principal, if you're not actually a government or a foreign political organisation, we have to show that you're related to a foreign government or political organisation, and that has proved to be a complex thing to do in practice, and ironically more complex in demonstrating that connection when we're dealing with non-democratic autocratic regimes that are themselves less transparent. And getting that information, which isn't easily available in many cases, to show, to be able to trace that influence back to the foreign government has been a challenge in a number of instances. We've got a range of exemptions as well from the scheme for charities, religious activities, diplomacy. And
one question I had,
yes,
sorry to interrupt,
yes.
Is it just about activities that are directed at the federal government, or is this about any attempt to influence debate in Australia? I'm thinking about if an organisation or an individual is trying to lobby a state government, for example, do they have to register with FITS?
That is a good point, and no, just the nature of our federation means we had limited scope from federal level to actually cover our state governments or local governments. So it's certainly the case that we're actually seeing more of those activities now at those lower levels of government. And I think a number of our state governments are considering whether they might implement similar schemes, but ours is just at that federal level. Because it does cover sort of political communication and some of our political organisations, there's probably a level of flow through in some cases across layers of government, but generally it really operates at that federal sphere. In terms of what appears on the public register, it's really the details about who is registering, the foreign principal that they're related to, and the country or jurisdiction that that foreign principal is associated with, and then a description of the kind of registrable activities. Yes, I think there's probably not as much detail as far in terms of exactly what activities are being undertaken, and variation if you look at the register and just what people have put in those descriptions when they've registered. We've got some more stringent reporting requirements that kick in when we've got federal elections, and people need to refresh registrations and have sort of just some tighter requirements around timeframes for registering during electoral processes. And we as administrators of the scheme also sort of have participated in an electoral assurance task force, so looking more actively along with other Commonwealth federal government agencies for influence that's operating during electoral periods as well, using the scheme, but also the powers of other agencies at those times. And similarly to FARA, as John Demers mentioned, we've got similar disclosure requirements on communications as well. So any material that's produced, disseminated, needs to have that disclosure about the foreign principle on it also. We also did impose some much broader registration requirements, which have their own challenges on former ministers and senior office holders. So our former cabinet ministers have a lifetime obligation to register any activity they undertake on behalf of a foreign principal, whether or not it's focused at political or government influence. That tends to mean they're sort of often captured, and we spend quite a bit of our time working with some of those former ministers about their registrations as well. Yes, what I think we've seen in terms of impact from our scheme, it's interesting, I think partly because of that perception about the scheme and because it went through with legislation on foreign interference. In some ways, we've seen a number of instances where individuals have actually stopped undertaking those activities in order to avoid registration, which the scheme isn't intended to prohibit any activity, but it certainly had a dissuasive or deterrent effect in some cases, and individuals have in some cases stopped undertaking roles on behalf of foreign principals. We've seen very directly and have seen yes, say for Confucius Institutes, new agreements that have been established which specifically state that no activities that are registrable under this scheme will be undertaken by them, for example. A few of the things that, yes, it is quite interesting watching that. I mean, I think the nature of the challenge of registrars and schemes is still, yes, you obviously have sort of layers of influence that are sometimes difficult to trace. So registers have their limitations probably in bringing transparency to everything, but we have noticed definite effects from introducing this in Australia. For our scheme, some of the challenges, I think I touched on this, are just that perception, because it was a package of legislation that came through with foreign interference and espionage laws, so a perception that attaches to the register as there's something kind of improper or inappropriate about engaging in influence activities that has just, I think, made compliance more of a challenge in some cases. And certainly, you know, just sensitive politically, I think, because too of its very wide coverage of former ministers, etc. Those perception issues can be difficult because it can be perceived as a sort of blacklist of foreign agents in terms of how it's reported on at times. And for us as well, I think a significant challenge was as it went through Parliament, because of that perception, a lot of stakeholders lobbied for further exemptions or narrowing of definitions. And that has meant that a number of things were done to the scheme that did narrow some of those definitions and introduced quite a lot of complexity in tracing connections back to foreign states. So it would be an easier scheme to apply, I think, if it did just capture foreign companies or foreign individuals. But we have to go through a process of identifying whether there's substantial or total control, or whether an entity is accustomed to acting according to the wishes of a foreign state, and that particularly for non-democratic states, they're inherently less transparent. That has its challenges and complexity in applying what I think originally was conceived of as just a broader registration scheme, and more complexity in enforcement. And probably the sort of last thing I would just mention from our perspective too is for enforcement options. We did introduce an information gathering power, and that's quite effective in gathering information where we need to, and we similarly follow that process of applying letters of, and starting with letters of inquiry. I think it's easier for us to gather information on the nature of activities, etc., from entities or individuals who are here in Australia. But for us, part of the missing information gap is sometimes about that foreign entity that is in a foreign country, and getting information at that point, even using our powers here, is extremely challenging.
That is literally the perfect segue to Philip Howard, actually, if I can bring Professor in now, because that point of complexity and people being able to operate from anywhere, that really highlights, this is a major government has a difficulty managing this. And then you move into the online world where tech companies themselves are somehow now expected to take on this responsibility. So I guess my question to you, Professor, is around how much do governments need to get involved in regulating things like political advertising online, and how much can we expect the tech companies to actually handle themselves when they don't have all of this history and infrastructure that a national government does to try and manage this process?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. Of course, most democracies, one of the things that makes them strong democracies, most democracies have campaign rules, have campaign guidelines, and systems of fines for politicians who spend money inappropriately or violate any of the campaign rules. So I would say that for most countries, most democracies already have many of these rules on the books, and it's a matter of perhaps updating or figuring out or resourcing the federal agencies sufficiently to be able to follow through on the charge they've been given by legislators. I would say we're past the point of industry self-regulation on this. I think we're well past the point in which industry can be left to come up with voluntary guidelines. I think looking around the world, probably the European Commission is the one public agency that has the teeth and to come up with guidelines through a public consultative conversation, and follow through with a world of hurt of fines or antitrust conversations if need be. So there are only a few governments that tend to act with strength in this area. But the social media platforms themselves increasingly ask for regulation. Engineers often like to design to guidelines. And we've seen multiple calls from the very top end of Facebook and Google for some guidance from elected leaders. I think one of the tricky things is that there's probably a domain of policy influence that involves regulating content. And I don't think we want industry to do that. And we almost certainly don't want government to do that either. The other bucket of policy options are market-led nudges, right? Fines, antitrust guidance that is about diversifying the market, directing revenue to professional and independent journalists. So there are things other than content regulation that I recommend. One of the tricks for these registry lists is that a growing amount of content comes from state-backed media agencies. And so, are Russia Today's journalists to be listed on such a list? Should CGTN's journalists be listed on a list? I think every democracy that comes up with a list with this kind of list is going to have to wrestle with the question of how to identify where to put journalists from state-backed media agencies that work with authoritarian regimes.
Now, I've let us run a little bit over time, so I think we've got about 2 minutes for each speaker to go into that last section of the discussion. And that was really going to be framed around where you think the OECD needs to nudge its members when it updates its lobbying principles. Maybe I can just stick with you, Professor Howard, for an answer there.
My answer would be fairly quick. I'd end with returning to campaign rules. I think some good standardization for what a media blackout period looks like, what a reasonable budget should be. These vary from Republican to parliamentary systems, but having good campaign election rules and enforcing them is the key to running a good, clean election.
Fantastic. Sarah Chidgey, we'll go back to you.
Thanks. So I think, from our perspective, we have found that extending beyond our lobbying requirements to cover foreign influence to be a useful measure, and probably for me, just drawing on some of the lessons we'd learned so far, I think very much that transparency principle, having clear and simple and relatively broad scope in terms of registration, I think provides that best broad transparency picture, and you sort of have a sort of full and graduated set of enforcement mechanisms to back those registration and transparency schemes as well.
Fantastic. And John Demers, the final word to you. Any nudges you want to give the OECD, or any nudges you want the OECD to give to the US? Oh, we've got you on mute, unfortunately, John. Good to know. I'm in good company.
Good. No. So mandated transparency, I agree with Philip, voluntariness doesn't work. Transparency, though, of the actors, but also transparency of the government. So one thing we've tried to do is explain how we're applying the law and post publicly advisory opinions and other documents that help would-be registrants understand when they need to register and when they don't need to register. So mandated transparency and transparency on the government side. Political neutrality, as we talked about, that really focuses on the identity of the speaker and not the content of the speech. And then ultimately, in a topic we talked about, I think less today, which is disinformation, is resiliency on the part of the public that's receiving these messages. And one of the things that we try to do when we bring cases, when we talk about these issues publicly, is to use those opportunities to really educate the public as to what mainly, as I said, autocratic regimes are saying and trying to say here in the US, and educating them so they can also spot this for themselves and protect themselves against it.
Fantastic. Well, if I could sum up a couple of points, or what I'm taking away from this session at least, it's that obviously diplomacy is not the target of these systems for transparency and reporting. That's a different category of activity to the sort of more covert and criminal activity that the different jurisdictions here are seeking out. I'm getting the clear sense that it's non-democracies that are tending to fall foul of these transparency systems, and that they're obviously quite complex to manage, especially if you're introducing them for the new time. So hopefully that means people will lean on the OECD and be involved in that process to help them get started on their own journey towards transparency. And I certainly take on board the point that we're past the point of self-regulation. You've all very clearly said that we need to have standardized and mandatory systems, and the more we can get on the same page, hopefully the more we will move to eliminate some of this undue influence. I want to thank each of the panelists for joining for this session. So thank you to each of you. Before we wrap up for the day at the conference, we're going to hear from Elsa Pilachowski, who's the Director of Public Governance at the OECD. And then finally, to wrap us up, from Jeffrey Schlagenhauf, who's the Deputy Secretary General at the OECD. So thanks again to the panelists, and then over to our OECD speakers.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to some of you, good evening to others. Let me thank all our distinguished speakers today and our audience for joining us today for what has been a really very informative, very stimulating discussion, very frontier discussion on what is a major challenge today to the health of our democracies. I think one of the things we can start from as a conclusion from what was said today is that, of course, policymaking doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is the result of process of discussions, interactions, and various influences. We have heard many times today that this can have a constructive impact on everyday life. And this is why recognizing the importance of lobbying, reducing opportunities for undue influence or the monopoly of influence should be high on the global political agenda. It will certainly be a priority for the OECD as we begin the process of revising the OECD principles for transparency and integrity in lobbying. On the basis of our report and building upon the discussions of today, which again were extremely rich, allow me to outline some of the issues that should be addressed by the revision of the principles. First, we need a very comprehensive understanding of lobbying, one that goes beyond traditional narrow definitions and encompasses all the ways in which governments can be influenced. In particular, we need to incorporate all lobbying tools, including social media and the financing of think tanks and grassroots organizations. We've heard many times and many different ways of saying it today. We heard from the Secretary General, we're moving from handshakes to hashtags, but there have been many other ways of saying the same thing. We also need to cover all actors, not just consultant lobbyists and government officials, but also companies, NGOs, lawyers, trade associations, and research institutions. As many policies are decided at the subnational level or local level, it is essential that these participants and policymakers are also included in our recommendation. The last session, with a special focus on foreign governments, influence on domestic policy was really an important issue. I think we can all recognize that. We heard today the risk associated with such influence, including threats to our basic democratic processes. Governments cannot afford to compromise on this. We must therefore be able to filter legitimate foreign influence from that whose only objective is to weaken or undermine government policies. Finally, ensuring the integrity of the influence process within both governments and businesses and between each and every individual is fundamental. New efforts to strengthen legitimate political engagement should include a new generation of integrity standards and practical guidance adapted to the realities and risks of lobbying in the 21st century. The COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the susceptibility of some governance frameworks to succumb to undue influence and conflicts of interest. But the crisis has also shown a new way forward. Canada, for example, a country that provides frequent and comprehensive information on lobbying, was able to provide a very high degree of transparency and accountability in the government response to the crisis. Such disclosure measures could prove useful to other countries in the recovery phase and beyond. The objective of establishing principles on lobbying is not to restrict it, nor is it to provide a bureaucratic or cumbersome approach. Instead, we should look to creating a new paradigm of collaboration between public officials, business, and other stakeholders. The only way out of the complex global and domestic challenges facing our societies, be that climate change, inequality, or health, is through a joint effort with all players. Thank you again. Let me just also highlight what Mrs. Jourova said at the beginning, that this is about trust. This is about trust in institutions. This is about the health of our democracies. So we look forward to entering this new chapter of influence that provides valuable insights to policymakers through integrity and transparency. Let me also take this opportunity to thank my team and the whole integrity team under the leadership of Julio Bacio for the really excellent and enormous work they have carried out over 2 years with this report, in particular also Pauline Bertrand. And now I would like to give the floor for his closing remarks to Deputy Secretary General Jeff Schlagenhoff. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elsa, and a great thanks to the Public Governance Directorate's or the Governance Directorate's team today for their efforts. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or evening, morning, depending on where you are. Thank you all for participating in today's conference on lobbying in the 21st century. The discussion has brought to light many important factors in the complex area of political influence. As we have said throughout, lobbying, in nearly all of its forms, is a legitimate act of political participation, and if done properly, can lead to more inclusive and better informed decision-making. A healthy, well-functioning democracy is one that listens and acts upon the interest of all stakeholders, not just a select few. We learned from Canada's experience that only through clear regulation can we begin to weed out opaque practices of political influence. those that put financial gain over socioeconomic progress. Furthermore, regulating both parties is shown to have an impact on how governments and private interests develop policies, as demonstrated by Ireland's Lobbying Act. However, despite lobbying regulations across OECD countries and certain efforts from the private sector to self-regulate, there remains widespread concern that too few interests are able to shape too much of government policy. The COVID-19 crisis has also shed new light on the key role that lobbying plays in the way governments address major global challenges, such as public health emergencies and climate change. During the discussion, experts and business leaders underlined the necessity for responsible lobbying, not only by companies, but across all sectors. Stronger and clearer guidelines can improve collaboration and stimulate real progress in finding global solutions to our global problems. It is important for government, business, and civil society to work together in a transparent way, even more so when their activities are under increasing scrutiny in our hyper-accessible society. As we've heard during today's dialogue, the practice of lobbying and the actors involved have evolved drastically over recent decades. The time when a lobbyist simply engaged with a policymaker on a given issue is, by today's standards, a quaint notion. Public opinion and policy can be shaped by various methods, including foreign political parties and governments, through funding political groups or activities, or via the media. This creates legitimate concern over the potential spread of mis- and disinformation and can risk undermining a country's national security and democratic processes. Australia and the United States provided concrete examples of how targeted legislation, such as the Foreign Agents Registration Act and the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme, respectively, can serve to protect and promote integrity and transparency in foreign influence. Like many issues in public governance, lobbying does not occur in isolation. It has far-reaching implications for policymakers, business, and citizens. We've learned from the new OECD report that more guidance, standards, and consistency is required for all actors in the policymaking sphere if lobbying is to truly serve its legitimate purpose and ensure a plurality of voices are represented. The current cultural and legislative environment must go further and create a framework that reflects the 21st century world we are living in, replete with new technology, new methods of communication, and different cultural understandings of what lobbying means. In the words of the OECD Secretary General that Elsa recently mentioned, lobbying is changing from handshakes to hashtags. The rules need to change too. Over the next 2 years, the OECD will be working on improving this framework, supported by its working party of senior public integrity officials. And to close, as former Justice Louis Brandeis said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Let's continue to place integrity and transparency at the heart of public policy making. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. This is an important area we need to address if we're going to ensure trust in our governments and trust in our institutions. Thank you.